Welcome back, everyone. Ready for another deep dive?
Always.
Okay, so today we're going to unpack the world of Chris Butler.
Hmm.
You might know him as Jagat Guru Sitaswarapananda Paramahamsa. It's a mouthful, I know.
Right.
And the organization he leads, the Science of Identity Foundation, or SIFO for short.
Okay.
And sometimes you'll see it referred to as IWOT or Mishit Zaitani.
I've seen that. Yeah.
Yeah, so we've got like a ton of sources for this one.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, we've got excerpts from books on cults, online articles,
Mhm.
forum discussions, social media posts, even some political stuff. It's a real mix.
It's like a good one.
Yeah, so basically, like, what we're trying to do is figure out, like, who is this guy? What are the practices and controversies around CFO?
Yeah.
And what is it like for the people involved, you know?
Yeah.
So, like, one of the things that really jumped out at me right off the bat was, like, Butler's journey.
Yeah.
You know, like, how he goes from the simple life to, like, living in the lap of luxury.
Yeah. Yeah. It's really striking, the contrast there.
Yeah.
Especially after his guru, Prabhupada, passes away. I mean, suddenly he's got staff, multiple houses, a wife.
Yeah.
It's a pretty cushy lifestyle for someone with the title Paramahamsa, which usually means, like, renouncing all that stuff.
It's definitely, I don't know, it's a bit jarring, right?
It is. Yeah.
And then there's all this stuff about his followers, you know, being like super devoted, like kissing his feet, drinking the water he's washed in, even eating his toenails.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah,
I know.
that's a lot. It's intense.
Yeah, and Butler hasn't actually been charged with any crimes, unlike some other gurus we've looked at.
Right.
But there are definitely criticisms and allegations. Like
Yeah.
some ex-members say he was taking double donations for himself.
Really?
Yeah, and that's considered like a huge no-no in traditional practices.
Yeah, it's like this concept of operata that keeps popping up.
Offense.
Yeah, exactly. And it seems like some ex-members felt like shunned or mistreated if they, you know, left or questioned Butler.
Right, right.
Which is like, you know, that makes you think about like power dynamics and stuff.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So to be clear, this idea of operata is like super important in Gaudiya Vaishnavism.
Mm.
That's the tradition Sifo comes from.
Okay, yeah.
And it basically stresses the seriousness of offenses against the guru or the
Wow.
teachings. So you can imagine how Butler, allegedly taking these double donations,
Mm-hmm.
would be seen as a major operata.
Mm.
And maybe that explains why some ex-members feel so betrayed and angry even.
Yeah, that makes sense. And some of them even give like specific examples, right? Like they talk about name calling, restrictions on who could marry who.
Really?
Yeah, it's like where's the line between guidance and control, you know?
Yeah, no, that's a good point. And then you throw in this whole thing with Paramahamsadas.
Who's that?
So he's a high-ranking SIF member who got involved in, get this, a global drug smuggling operation.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah, it's crazy, right? And it really makes you wonder, like, did SIF know about this? Does this contradict everything they're supposedly about?
That is wild. So on that note, we actually have some excerpts here from some academic sources on cults, you know?
Okay.
And they talk about like the characteristics of cults and, you know, how even a spiritual path can go wrong.
Gotcha. Yeah.
And one of the things they talk about is like warning signs,
Mm-hmm.
things like fragmentation within the group,
You're right.
simplification of the teachings, misuse of practices. And this is a big one, like a mismatch between how the leaders present themselves
Yeah.
and like their actual inner state. You know what I mean?
Right. It's like judging a book by its cover.
Exactly.
And we see that a lot with what you might call superficial Orientalism.
What's that?
It's this thing where, like, some Western groups, they get into Eastern practices, but they kind of focus on the exotic stuff.
Okay.
The rituals, the aesthetics, but they're not really getting the deeper meaning or
Yeah.
like achieving real spiritual development.
So basically, appearances can be deceiving. And we shouldn't assume that someone's doing the rituals means they're like spiritually advanced.
Exactly.
So bringing this back to Sifa, right? Some of their practices, like the whole emphasis on Butler's personal items, the strict rules, it kind of lines up with these cult characteristics, doesn't it?
It does. And when you add in the allegations from former members
Yeah.
about manipulation and control,
Mm-hmm.
it makes you wonder where Sifo falls on that spectrum, you know?
Yeah. That's a good question. And speaking of like getting a clearer picture, we actually found a list of over 500 names.
Wow.
Yeah, supposedly connected to Sifuo,
Hmm.
and it's got details about their locations and even involvement in political campaigns.
Interesting. So, like, actual names?
Yeah, and some of them are connected to some pretty big political figures too.
Okay, this is getting interesting.
Mm,
So it makes you think, like, how much reach and influence does Seafight actually have?
right, especially in politics.
Yeah, especially in politics. But before we go there, we need to hear from the people who actually lived inside C4I, right?
Yeah, those ex-member forums, those are gold.
Exactly. Let's see what they have to say.
Okay, okay, so those ex-member forums, right? Like,
Yeah.
they really give you a sense of what it was like to actually be part of Sifuo.
Wait.
And like one thing that just kept coming up over and over again was this whole like rigid hierarchy
Yeah.
and like this feeling of control, you know? It wasn't just about spiritual guidance, it was like everything.
Yeah, they talk about how even personal decisions, like who you could marry, what job you could have,
Right,
all that stuff
exactly.
had to be, like, approved by the higher-ups in the organization.
Yeah. There's this one story that really stuck with me from a former member in Poland. They were like pressured to quit their job.
Wow.
Yeah, and just devote themselves totally to Sifia. It's like they were expected to put the group's needs above their own, like, well-being.
Yeah, that's not good.
Yeah.
And it's a classic sign of, cult-like behavior, putting the group above the individual like that.
Yeah, and it's not just about personal sacrifices either.
Right.
There are all these accusations about financial exploitation, too.
Oh, yeah. A lot of that in the forums.
Yeah. And it's not just directed at Butler. It's like the whole organization.
Right. And what's interesting is they talk about this pressure to donate money,
Yeah.
like a lot of money. And
Yeah.
it's always framed as like supporting the mission or, getting spiritual favor or whatever.
Right. Some even said they were fined.
Really?
Yeah, for like offenses against the organization or even Butler himself.
That's messed up. I mean, talk about control, right?
Yeah, it's pretty scary. And then there's this stuff about Butler, like, demanding followers give him their patents and,
Right.
like, the rights to their inventions and stuff.
Oh, come on, really?
Yeah, it's like,
Yeah.
where does spiritual leadership end and personal gain begin, you know?
Yeah. No, that's definitely crossing a line. But, as bad as the financial stuff is, the emotional manipulation is even worse, I think.
Yeah, they talk about this culture of, like, fear and guilt, you know?
Mhm.
If you questioned Butler or even expressed doubt, you could be, like, isolated or accused of being spiritually impure.
It's like, how can you even think straight in an environment like that?
Right. It's no wonder some people say their time in Saifawat was, like, traumatic.
It sounds traumatic, yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, and there was that one detail, I don't know if you saw this, about Butler's wife telling people to eat his toenails.
Oh, yeah, yeah. That was,
It's just like, I don't even know what to say. It's creepy,
yeah,
right?
it's super unsettling.
It really shows you the level of, I don't know, reverence or maybe even blind faith that they had for this guy.
It's important to remember these are allegations,
Of course, of course.
but when you see so many people saying the same things,
Yeah.
it's hard to ignore, right?
Totally. You have to take it seriously. But also, be critical and compassionate and realize that people can exaggerate or, be genuinely hurt,
Yeah, definitely. So this brings us back to that list of names.
right? The Cepha members.
Yeah, it's not just some random list. It's like really relevant when you start looking at the political connections, especially with Tulsi Gabbard.
Yeah, Gabbard, that's the big one, right? Her whole career and the SIF's alleged influence, that's a whole rabbit hole.
Right. It's crazy. So many campaign donations came from people who had never donated to any political campaign before.
Really?
Yeah. So, like, were they really supporting Gabbard or were they, pressured by the organization?
That's the question, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's a tough one. You want to be careful about making accusations without proof.
Mm-hmm.
But, when you see the money trail and Gabbard's connected to SIF, it's definitely suspicious.
Yeah, and it gets even more suspicious when you consider those allegations about SIF having a, like, secret political
Right.
agenda.
Right.
Some ex-members say they were, like, pushing specific candidates or ideologies.
That's a big deal. I mean, that's talking about, like, undue influence in politics.
Exactly. And there's this one quote I think you'll find interesting Butler said about Gabbard. She's got a servant's attitude, a servant's heart.
Ooh, that's a loaded statement.
Right. It kind of implies, like, ownership or control.
It does. But, we have to be fair. There are people who were involved with SIF who defend Gabbard. These
Hmm.
her beliefs are her own, and she's not being controlled by anyone.
Right, and Gabbard herself has never said publicly that Sif is influencing her political decisions.
Right. It's complicated, you know.
Hmm.
It's not black and white.
Yeah, there's a lot going on. We're not trying to, like, tell you what to think.
No, not at
We're
all.
just laying it all out so you can make up your own mind.
You got it. Informed decisions. That's what we're all about.
As we're going through all this, I keep wondering, is this really about Chris Butler?
That's interesting.
Or is it about the organization he leads? Is SIF just an extension of him, or does it have its own, like, life?
That's a good question. It really gets at the heart of how these organizations, especially the ones built around a charismatic leader,
Yeah.
how they like evolve, you know?
Yeah, right. We've seen how Butler's teachings and practices have shaped Sifway, but has the organization also shaped him?
It's possible.
Yeah.
And then you have this whole thing about groupthink where like people in a closed system, they just keep reinforcing each other's beliefs.
Yeah.
And that can lead to some pretty messed up stuff.
Yeah, and speaking of messed up stuff, there's this whole thing from the ex-member discussions about a child who died.
Oh yeah, that was awful. A family of IoT followers.
Yeah, and it seems like the kid's death was investigated. And some ex-members are saying that the organization's practices or beliefs might have played a role.
It's a really sensitive topic, obviously. And we don't have all the details,
Yeah.
but it does raise questions about, blind obedience and the need for critical thinking.
Yeah, even, or maybe especially in spiritual communities.
Exactly. It's like a wake-up call, right?
Right.
Even groups that talk about peace and love can have harmful stuff going on.
Right, and it makes you think about the responsibility of the leaders to make sure their followers are safe.
Yeah, especially vulnerable people, like kids.
This is heavy stuff.
Yeah.
And we're not done yet.
We're not.
In the final part of our deep dive, we're going to zoom out even further and look at the big picture.
Sounds good.
Power, belief, the search for meaning, all that good stuff.
The big questions.
Exactly. Okay, so as we kind of wrap up this deep dive into Chris Butler and Sifa,
Yeah.
I think it's important to zoom out a bit, and think about the bigger picture.
Yeah.
What does all this tell us about, power and belief and people searching for meaning, especially, nowadays?
It's a really good question. And it shows how this isn't just about one guy or one group,
Mm-hmm.
It's like it reflects these bigger trends, these bigger questions about spirituality in
Yeah.
our time.
Yeah, it's interesting, right? How these Eastern traditions, especially from India, have become so popular in the West. But we've seen, there's always this risk of things getting twisted, when you're dealing with such powerful ideas.
Yeah, absolutely. Like the guru-disciple relationship.
Yeah.
It's supposed to be about trust and guidance, right? But in these closed systems where you're not allowed to question anything,
Mm-hmm.
it can become like a breeding ground for manipulation and even abuse.
Yeah, and the stuff we've seen with Sifa, the control, the financial exploitation, even the emotional abuse,
Right.
it shows you how that dynamic can go really wrong.
Yeah, and sadly, Sifawood is not unique,
Uh-huh.
Throughout history, you see these spiritual movements that turn into cults,
Right.
and it often ends badly for the followers.
So, how do we protect ourselves from that kind of thing?
That's the key, right? I think it's about developing critical thinking skills and not being afraid to be skeptical.
Yeah.
Even when you're dealing with a charismatic leader or like teachings that sound really profound,
Right.
you got to question things, look for different perspectives, and don't be afraid to challenge authority, especially if something feels wrong.
And know the warning signs, the red
Yeah.
flags of a cult.
Totally. Things like isolating members,
Mm.
demanding obedience, using fear and guilt to control people,
Yeah.
that kind of stuff.
And remember, real spiritual growth, it's an internal thing.
Yeah.
It's not about the rituals or how devoted you are to some leader.
It's about wisdom and compassion and
Yeah.
connecting with like the divine, whatever that means to you.
Yeah. It's not about blindly following rules or giving up your free will to some guru.
Exactly. And the line between a real spiritual path and a harmful cult, it can be blurry.
It can.
Yeah. And this whole deep dive, I think it's a good reminder that we all need to be careful. We got to be aware, educate ourselves, and have the courage to question our beliefs.
Even the ones that are really important to us.
Exactly. It's about protecting ourselves from manipulation.
It's been quite a journey, this deep dive. We started with Chris Butler and Sifai,
Yeah.
but we ended up talking about so much more.
Right, did.
Power, belief, the responsibility we all have to be careful on our spiritual paths.
It's all connected.
It is.
And before we go, I'm going to leave you with one last thought. What have we learned about why people search for meaning?
Hmm.
What makes us vulnerable to being manipulated? And how can we be stronger and wiser so we can make good choices on our own paths?
Good questions.
Yeah. Keep questioning, keep searching, and never stop thinking critically.
Great advice. Thanks for joining us for another deep dive.
My pleasure. Always
Yeah.
a good time.